This episode of the .NET Core podcast is brought to you in part by Conftalks.dev. There are thousands of conferences going on all around the world. Just imagine looking for a comprehensive list of .NET Core conferences and you'll see what I mean. Conftalks.dev wants to help with that. It's a free service that not only wants to tell you all about the upcoming conferences in your area, but also wants to make sure you never miss the opportunity to attend or speak at one. So sign up for Conftalks at conftalks.dev today so you'll never forget about that conference again. The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Godrogman-Taylor, and this is episode 23, Microservices in .NET Core with Christian Horsdal. In this episode, we talked a lot about microservices, medium services, BFFs, and how you can go about testing your microservices. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. I just want to thank you, Christian, for being on the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Happy to chat.
It's great to be connected with you today and to have this chance to discuss microservices and all of the wonderful things about microservices. Because aside from going to a few talks on microservices, I haven't really built anything using them. So I'd be interested to find out, the benefits and pitfalls and things of creating them.
Well, it is all the rage and has been for a while, hasn't it? So to me, I guess the really great benefit of it is that it's so closely connected to continuous delivery, really. That's usually sort of where I start talking about microservices. And if I talk to clients about introducing microservices or not, that's usually where I go. That there's a lot of work involved in doing microservices. So I think the motivation should really be the agility and the flexibility you can gain from continuous delivery, because to my mind at least, it's almost impossible to build microservices without doing continuous delivery, and then vice versa. It's easier to do continuous delivery with a microservice architecture than with many other architectures. So I'm not saying it's the only one that you can do continuous delivery with, but it's just one that lends itself to that kind of working. So I think that's where really a lot of the value lies, in the flexibility you can get from that. So that can enable businesses to turn around quickly, change their minds, experiment even, like putting something out quickly, just running it for a while, see if it works, then change it a little bit, see if that works better, and so on. That kind of agility and that kind of flexibility, I think, can be enabled by the microservices, and that's a huge value, at least for organizations that know how to take advantage of that, if that makes sense.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. What I'd like to do before I touch on any of the points you've raised there is, could you quickly just introduce yourself? Is that okay?
Sure, yes. My name is Christian and I live in Denmark. I work as a consultant/contractor. So I get to visit various companies and help them with their systems. And sort of that goes from coming into a company as a contractor and being sort of a hired hand, being a developer along with everybody else, but also doing stuff like architecture reviews or helping people set up an architecture. I've helped some startups in sort of figuring out how to set up their development and finding other developers and stuff like that. So it's kind of varied. And so relating to this podcast, I wrote the book Microservices in .NET Core, which was published by Manning almost 2 years ago now. So that gave me a good excuse to really learn Core and do a lot of work with Core before it came out. And sort of off the back of that, I also run some courses on some trainings on .NET Core as well as on microservices and other stuff. So different kinds of bits and bobs with companies here and there. And then sort of occasionally speaking at conferences. It's not that much, but just a few times a year. And then I would love to bring my my blog back to life, but it kind of fell to the wayside while I was writing the book, and then I haven't got back into the swing. So I hope I will.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. For a long time, I ran 3 blogs myself, and then...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, then one of those blogs transitioned to be a podcast, and then I created this podcast. So, the blogs have taken a backseat for a while.
Yeah, but the podcast must be a lot of work too.
Yeah, but I myself am an auditory learner, so I learn best by listening.
Right.
So just listening through to it and editing a few times, it helps it to really sink in, which is incredibly useful for me.
Yeah.
Touching on microservices then, what is a microservice?
That's a good question, and I believe you can find a lot of different definitions of that. The one that I tend to use when I talk about it, and the one that I use in my book, is that a microservice is a very narrowly focused service that has a few characteristics. So number one is that it's a service that is responsible for a single piece of functionality. Secondly, it's something that can be individually deployed. That is, it can be deployed without sort of deploying anything else in the system, deployed to production, that is. And it owns its own data store, so it has some data that naturally belongs to it, and it is the source of truth for that data, and it owns the data store where that goes into, and sort of is responsible for keeping that around. And then sort of like some gray area as well, which is around the sort of micro part of it. So micro, what does it mean? Does it have to be really small? What's that sort of about? And I don't know. It doesn't have to be that small, really. But then on the other hand, I tend to think that sort of a typical software team around, 3 to 5 persons or something like that should probably be able to maintain like 10 microservices. And that's definitely gray area saying that, because that depends on how much development has to go on those services, how many bugs do they have, how many new features do they need, so on and so forth. But I do think it kind of gives people an idea of what we're talking about in terms of the size I think about when you talk about microservices. So those things are some characteristics that I tend to use in 2 ways. So when I go into a company and they say, we're doing microservices, then I like to look at them and see if their services adhere to those characteristics or not. Sometimes I don't really think what you're doing is microservices. And that's not a judgment call. It's just a matter of recognizing what it is and what it isn't. Because it can be absolutely fine being something else, but it's nice to being able to recognize it. And then the other way around as well. If I work for a company and we've decided that we are going to try to do microservices, then I like to keep these things in mind and keep on saying, okay, is this still individually deployable? If it's not really a microservice, and we've decided to go with the microservices because of the benefits it can give us in terms of flexibility and so on. And if we lose track of that, then we lose the value. And other things like, is it still sort of single responsibility? Does it only implement one business capability, or is it being broader than that? So you can sort of guide the design of the microservices, but it also helps in recognizing what a microservice is, I think. So that's the definition I go by. And I'm sure you can find a million different definitions on the internet at this point.
Yeah, I think that's, both the great and horrible thing about design patterns is that everyone has their own implementation.
Yeah.
Let's say I have a web application and I've got a web UI and an API. Would that web UI be classed as a microservice, or would I need to break that down into smaller chunks to make it into a microservice in your definition?
I would probably tend to break it down into smaller chunks. I think there's a few different ways of attacking the UI. And I think some of it has to do with where we want to compose the functionality, because I think it's also important to recognize that breaking the system down to many, many small little microservices might be great on the back end. It might be great from a developer standpoint, from a business agility standpoint. But that doesn't mean that the end users want to be confronted with that. They want a coherent UI, of course. They don't want to know that we've broken the system into 100 or 1,000 different microservices. Why should they care really about each of those individual ones? So at some point, we do need to make that into one coherent thing. And I think that can be all the way inside the browser. I mean, with a SPA, you can make a composite application and draw on different microservices for painting different parts of the page and showing that to the user. But that moves you into sort of having a thicker client that needs to know some more about the backend architecture. So you can also move that to something like a gateway on the backend. So a gateway could be the thing that exposes the API to the outside world, and then behind that we have a lot of microservices, but it's just really a thin layer that just proxies onto the other microservices, but translates it a little bit into a slightly more coherent set of APIs where naming might follow slightly different conventions than you have on the inside of that. And then a third route, which I guess is a little bit in between the two, and one that I think you can have actually pretty good success with, is the Bff pattern. And it's not best friends forever. It's backend for front end. But I'm sure there's some tongue-in-cheek going on there. But a backend for front end is sort of a specialized gateway. So it's kind of like a gateway, but it doesn't expose everything. It could expose just the things needed for the front page of a website, or the things needed for the details page of a website, or the things needed for the Android app or the iOS app. So it's kind of tightly coupled to the front end, or at least part of the front end. And then it translates to all the microservices on the back end. I think that can create kind of a nice situation where you can have the small services behind the scenes broken down by business capabilities, and those can be nice, self-contained, individual deployable, all these nice things. But then when you're in the UI code, in the app code, or in one of the pages on the website, then you just have one API that you talk to. And then the balance is that API doesn't grow to become sort of the new monolith, because I think that's a danger of the gateway approach that I also talked about. It has to be really, really thin. If you start putting a little bit of functionality into that gateway, it can easily become sort of the thing that attracts more and more functionality. And then you have these anemic microservices behind it, but all the real functionality is in the gateway. And then it's just a monolith. And if you didn't set out to make a good monolith, it probably isn't a good monolith. Then it's probably a bad monolith. So those are different approaches. And I think the one that I've had most success with has been the backend for front end approach. But I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but it's the one that I've seen most success with.
So if I unpack that a little bit and use, say, Netflix as an example, I know that they've been pretty vocal in the past few years about, hey, we have this wonderful testing framework and everything's a microservice, and even though our data centers went down, we were still able to serve stuff. Could a backend for front end or a BFF API or microservice, could the UI be split into, here is the microservice for search, here's the microservice for displaying recommendations, here's the microservice for, I don't know, genres of films, and here's the microservice perhaps for streaming the movie or the TV show that you're watching?
Yes, I don't know how Netflix have done it. I guess an approach could be that on the back end, you break it down by these capabilities, like search and maybe some different categorizations, and there's probably some things around the playback and stuff. There's probably a whole sort of back-end stuff going on with importing films and getting them subtitled, and I don't know. And then I guess if we were to look at that back-end for front-end pattern, then I would guess you could look at, say, there is the web UI, and that consists of different pages, or even maybe subparts of the page. Like we have, there's sort of the my list thing, and there's the continue watching, and there's the recommendations, and each of those sort of lines in the UI that people might know in the Netflix UI, I could imagine that could sort of have even its own backend for front end, and then draw on more than one microservice on the backend. Because maybe there's the recommendation itself, but maybe I could imagine maybe sort of the picture that you see on that page, maybe that's from another microservice. Maybe there's something around the language that a third microservice is involved in. So maybe even those bits of the UI actually draws on different microservices. So you could still imagine having that backend for frontend in between, so that the UI just talks to one endpoint, and then that draws on things from different microservices, maybe via HTTP endpoints on the backend, or you could have some eventing system. You pick up the data on the backend and ready to serve. I would say there would be different ways to go, and yeah, I wouldn't want to second guess how they've done it, but those are approaches at least you could see. So it can be quite broken down still with this backend for front-end thing. Or you could go slightly bigger and say, okay, I want the front page to have a backend for front-end, and then I want the player to have another one. And then they're somewhat bigger. But that's kind of a trade-off. And I think the trade-off there for me leans a lot towards what makes it easiest to implement the UI. So that's kind of what I want to drive how the backend for front-end looks. And then I can have other things that drive how the microservices are broken down at the back end of that. And then the backend for front-end is the glue between those two worlds. So that's also why I'm saying that the backend for front-end is somewhat tightly coupled to the UI, because that's why it exists. It exists to serve the UI, really, and to shield the UI from the complexity of the microservices on the backend.
So I wonder then, if I have some form of UI that requires a number of microservices to be called in order to render everything on the page, if we're talking web development land, because obviously microservices aren't just limited to web development. Web development, I guess, is an area where we can use microservices. But as the number of microservices increases, presumably the number of web requests that you need to make increases too, I guess.
Well, yeah, again, I guess that depends on how we attack that UI problem. If we go sort of the composite UI route and have everything assembled in the browser, then yeah, there would be a tendency towards that you actually see it drawing from more and more places. As it becomes more complex, then maybe you break the page down further. So like the left menu is from one microservice, and then there might be sort of the header from another and the footer from a third. And then there's a few content areas in the middle, and each of those draw from different microservices. But if we go with the gateway or the backend for front-end approaches, then those are our services on the backend, and they give us a chance to sort of consolidate things for the UI, because on the web or with a mobile client, I mean, the rules are still the same as they always have been, and making too many requests that costs, and people are sometimes on bad connections, and you don't want to use too much bandwidth and so on and so forth, and you want the page to render fast. So it still makes sense to consolidate that and to say, okay, the initial page request for the front end actually needs to get some data back. But that could be something that the gateway or BFF assembles from different microservices and then sends back to the browser, so it can actually render the first part of the page before it has to make any AJAX requests to get the next bits. And I guess the same somewhat goes for those AJAX requests, that instead of making 10 small calls, it's quite all right to, in that backend for front end, consolidate that into one call. Again, because I see the backend for front end as something that exists to make the UI easy to implement and perform well. So if the UI needs a certain endpoint, then the BFF will implement that endpoint. And that might mean that the BFF goes and talks to two different microservices and listens to maybe events from a queue from a couple of other ones and picks up some data, combines all 4 or 5 sources like that, and then returns that to the UI. So that there's only one request going on from the browser or from the mobile phone back to the servers. And then there's some server communication, but that's much faster, of course. So that's at least one way to get around that problem of the explosion of how much the UI has to talk to.
In that case, then, you could have almost a fuzzy metric for figuring out, oh, we're sending off 500 requests. That's too many. How many can we sort of combine and consolidate, as you said, into fewer requests? Maybe do, like you said, more server-side rendering of things, and maybe send actual HTML down the wire, or rather than sending data that then has to be parsed and rendered, can we do some of that rendering on the server and send it through?
Yeah, that could definitely make sense as well, to send fragments of HTML down, so it just readily can be incorporated into the page.
So we've talked a lot about microservices so far, and I do know that in the microservices book, you made a point of using Nancy FX.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could give us a really quick introduction to that, and maybe why you would or wouldn't use Nancy FX compared to, say, ASP.NET Core or ASP.NET.
Yeah, so Nancy is a .NET and .NET Core based web framework. And it has the mantra of giving the developer the super duper happy path. So you're supposed to, as a developer using Nancy, just naturally follow a road that leads you to success and just finding it easy. So Nancy tries hard to get out of your way. So there's a little syntax that you have to learn to use Nancy, but once you've learned that, it tries really hard to do what you would expect and have sensible defaults and not tie you very much to the framework. So it's quite easy to only touch Nancy in very small parts of your code. And it's very modular, so you can change out literally everything in Nancy. So you can use it out of the box, and it's great. And then if there is some corner that you want to make behave a little bit differently, you can change that out. So Nancy has a history of 8 years, I want to say. I'm not sure. Something like that. So it's definitely from a time when ASP.NET looked a lot different than ASP.NET Core does today. And I think, to be honest, Nancy used to have much more of an advantage over, say, MVC or Web API than it does today over MVC Core. So, yeah, the book is 2 years old, and I would probably go with MVC Core if I was writing it today. I still really, really like Nancy, but I do think the gap is a lot smaller today. I think MVC Core has a lot more sensible defaults than, well, MVC had a lot of sensible defaults as well, but I thought there were some things that I always bumped my head into, and I just don't find that as much with MVC Core. And I think it's easier to get the framework out of the way as well. And then I think a big thing as well that sort of changed with Core compared to more traditional ASP.NET is I think they cleaned up the pipeline. So Nancy all along let you down using stuff like Owen. So it lended itself really nicely to building upon an Owen pipeline. And that's been a great inspiration for the middleware model that we have in ASP.NET Core today. It's not exactly the same, but it's the same set of ideas. And I think that's actually really, really nice as well, and something that is just a lot simpler and a lot more composable than the way that ASP.NET used to work. So that's also an area where I think they've closed the gap a whole lot, that instead of having something like a self-hosted service using Owen and Nancy, then today everything in ASP.NET Core is essentially self-hosted, because it's essentially a console app where you create a web host and then you start that, and everything's go through the layers of middleware. And I think that's a nice, composable and pretty simple model. And then sort of at the end of that chain of middleware, you have the web framework. That could be Nancy, that could be MVC Core. I think both work really well. And Nancy works perfectly fine on Core as well. But I just don't think the gap is as big as it used to be. So I'm not completely sure, but I think if I was rewriting the book, I would go with MVC Core.
Sure. So there's still a usage for Nancy in the same way that there's still a usage for any technology once a new technology has come out. But you would recommend, I guess, starting with MVC Core because I guess it's built in?
Yeah, I think I would, because it's already pretty widespread and it's only growing. So, I mean, that's obviously not always the reason to choose something just because other people are using it. But as I said, since I think the gap is a lot smaller, I still think Nancy is more elegant. But there's not as much of a difference as there used to be. So I think the argument of using the thing that is probably easier to Stack Overflow and Google, I think that wins out today. So I think I would go with MVC Core. Another interesting project that sprang out, I guess, of Nancy, or at least is greatly inspired by Nancy, is something called Carter that Jonathan Channon, who also used to work on Nancy, or still does to some extent, I guess, created. And it's a set of libraries that basically uses the same syntax as Nancy. So it's sort of meant to look as much like Nancy as it can, but it doesn't have the ties to .NET Full Framework and Owen and so on. So it's more natively ASP.NET Core, if you will. So it's built on ASP.NET Core middleware directly, which I guess can give it sort of a leg up going forward with ASP.NET Core, just because it's more native to that stack. And then it still has the same syntax as Nancy and the simplicity of how that used to work. That's something I'm at least following and seeing where that goes. and very interesting project. So I'd recommend taking a look at that.
I know that there's a community version available on GitHub, so I'll make sure that there's a link to that so that people can go and have a look and check it out. So without giving away too much of the secret sauce in the book, is there a best practice or almost like a formulaic step-by-step how to design a system with microservices? Or is it just a case of your system will naturally, as you are designing it, it will just move slowly towards a microservices architecture?
I think it's more of the latter than the former. I definitely think that it's one of those things that's almost impossible to get right the first time around. I know there's some people that argue that you can't even start with microservices, that you sort of have to start with a monolith and then carve microservices out of that. I don't know that that's been my experience, but I mean, at least sort of repeatedly with clients, I see that when they start using microservices, the first one tends to sort of be something that when you look at it a year later, you look at it and then you go, it's not really micro, and I'm not even sure it's a service. It's kind of a thing, and it does something, and we learned from it, and then the next one became better, and the next one became better, and then maybe the fifth one. That's really a microservice, and we're happy with that. And so I think that this sort of a organizational learning curve in recognizing the right size and really recognizing the importance of, once you have defined that this microservice deals with one particular thing. So it could be something like the checkout flow on a web shop, probably even less than that. But recognize that that's what the microservice deals with. Then it looks like most organizations, for the first few, they tend to sort of put a bit more into it because we also need this small functionality, and then but we have this service right next to it already. We'll just put it in there, and then sort of at a later stage, they probably more get into the habit of saying, no, we're not putting it in there. We're spinning up a new service. But I think there's some habit there. And I think part of that is also has to do with the tooling around it that we build up as we go. So that ties back to something that I said at the top of the show, that I think one of the great benefits of microservices is how well it works together with continuous delivery. But it also kind of demands some of that, because it's kind of fine when you have a handful of services. You can sort of get along with a lot of things. But once you have 500 microservices, you really, really, really need to have some great automation around everything to do with those microservices, be it building them, keeping packages up to date, testing them on all the levels like unit testing, integration testing, system level testing, deploying them to, say, a QA environment and the production environment, monitoring them, all those kinds of things. You really have to have that in place. But then I think the thing that kind of happens is that the closer you get to having all those kinds of things in place, the more you tend to sort of align on how that's done. But that also means that creating a new microservice just becomes that much easier. So I think that's part of it, that as we go along, it becomes easier to create new microservices. So it's also easier to be in the habit of not putting too much functionality into the existing ones, but just going, I'm creating a new microservice for this. And then I guess at some point, really, you can get to the situation where that even feels like the easiest thing to do, just because, then I have my own little new pristine code base that I put this functionality in. I don't have to deal with anything else. And I know that setting up all the automation is easy because we've not only automated deployment and so on, we've automated building that pipeline. So we've sort of automated the automation, if you understand what I mean. At least that's what I see organizations do, just because you get into such large numbers that becomes necessary. But getting back to your question of how do you actually build these systems, I think there's sort of a whole other big area to learn in order to do this well, which is a lot less technical than much of what we've talked about now, which is the whole domain-driven design area. Because I think that's at the heart of designing microservices as well, that you understand domain-driven design and what a bounded context is, what a business capability is. Maybe use techniques like event storming to figure out how business flows actually work and what happens in what sequence and what tends to group together, because those groups are sort of potential microservices. But sort of in that whole area of thinking around DDD or domain-driven design, is also the fact that it's an exploration and it's something that evolves over time. So you get some of it right early on and some of it you don't. And I guess it's the same with microservices. You don't get them all right from the beginning. It's a growing thing. I think one of the rules of thumb I like to try to apply there is that when in doubt, I'd rather have a service be slightly bigger than it ideally would than slightly too small. Because when we can't get it exactly right, it's often because we don't know enough at that point in time. And it's easier to experiment somewhat within just one code base, one service. You can have your IDE do the refactorings and you can move the boundaries and things. And then you can sort of figure out what's the right way to structure this? What are the right concepts within the code? And then once you've done that, you might begin to recognize that, this microservice is actually doing two different things. So we can cut it in half and make those two nice services. But if we try to do that up front with too little knowledge, we might have sort of cut that the wrong way. So you had sort of half of one of the capabilities in one service and half of it in the other and all mixed together. And that means that then moving the code around is just more cumbersome because it's not one code base, so you can't really just refactor. And there's also the matter of deployment, that you easily get into a situation where those two microservices have to move in lockstep and have to be deployed at the same time. And that's difficult to do. So I'd rather, for a while, err on the side of slightly bigger, and then eventually move into these really small, really focused microservices, just from a practical standpoint.
The advice you've given there about start with slightly bigger microservices and you're potentially not going to get it right the first time is almost exactly the same advice I've been given when I've gone to talks where the subject has been, here is what a microservice is, and we did it wrong.
It's not necessarily wrong, really. There's a learning curve. And I think every company that ventures into this has a learning curve, if for no other reason than just because their domain is unique, and learning the domain on the level that you need to do domain-driven design and to break it down like this, that's a journey and that's a learning experience as well. So I think there's no way around the fact that there will be learning going on. If there wasn't, it almost wasn't development, was it?
I'd like to just touch on how you go about unit testing and integration testing microservices, only because my understanding is obviously if I have a microservice out there, let's say I have a foo microservice and I have a bar microservice. If my foo microservice talks to my bar microservice, can I mock that communication? And if so, how do I keep that in sync for when the microservices change or grow?
Yeah, I would usually mock that communication. So we can look at the kind of traditional testing pyramid, and that still mostly applies. So you have unit tests on the bottom, and those are, I guess, the same way as they would be in other systems. Then I think an interesting level of testing that I like to do with the microservices is exactly what you're talking about, which I sometimes call service level testing. So testing a complete service, but with all its collaborators, the other services mocked out. And depends on how that communication is done, that would dictate how the mocking would be done. If we're talking about HTTP communication, then I would actually usually just within the test process itself. So I might have like an XUnit project with the test in it. Then within that project, I would start a web host, an ASP.NET Core web host, and set up mocked endpoints right there. And just write canned responses that returns and use those in the test. So I would use the real service, maybe run it in like a test server, so you don't have as much overhead of going down into the network stack. But then giving that a configuration that makes it think that its collaborators are at different localhost ports, which all just point back to the test process itself, that then just have mocked endpoints. If you're using a queue and events, then you might need to actually have that queue running in, say, a container on your local host as well and on your test environment as well. And then, again, set up sort of consumers and producers for the events that you need to mock. But that is a good level of testing just because you get a very complete test of the service itself, but also because it's actually one of the areas where I think microservices can shine, because they're sort of small enough that testing all of the service isn't that hard. So I think you can get a really long way with testing at that level, and then using unit tests in conjunction with that for the places where you need it. So I like to follow an outside-in approach to my TDD around these services, and actually start from the outside with these tests that test the complete service, including a database, for instance, but mocking out collaborators. I think that's a really nice, and they can be reasonably fast, and then you get really good coverage. And then when that gets too slow, or it gets too much setup to get the service into a specific situation, then just change gears and use unit tests. That's fine as well. But I think that level of testing is really good. And then I guess the third one is to supplement that with system level tests as well, that not only tests one service, but tests the whole system, and thereby also the integration. So another possibility around looking at whether those mocks are still as they should be is that you might have a set of tests that you can run against the mock, but also against the real collaborator, and then compare the results. What is it? Contract testing or something like that, I believe Martin Fowler calls it. He has a blicky around there doing that kind of thing, where you test your mock and then test the real thing, just to make sure that your mock behaves in a manner that matches the real one.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, it is a contract test, as Martin Fowler described it. So yeah, you would run the test on, as you said, your mocked version of the microservice, and then run the same test against a live version of the same microservice and ensure that the results are the same.
Yeah, or at least similar. I think sometimes in practice it can be difficult to make them exactly the same, just because if you're testing against the real one, then you might sort of have data issues. Do you have the same data as the one that you're expecting in the mock and so on? But yeah, you can get around that and check that it looks like it's the same behavior still. But ultimately, I think you also need those system level tests. And by system level test, that can be testing through the UI even. So you don't want to test every little single piece of functionality that way, because that becomes too heavy. But all these sort of sunshine paths, I like to have tested through the UI as well, because that gives you the confidence that those integrations actually still work.
One of my final few questions, I do have a few more. So a lot of the talks I've been to have been very much Docker and Kubernetes and microservices because they make sense. However, do microservices require that sort of containerization and orchestration? Or is it literally just a case of I can have an API somewhere out on the web that just accepts a HTTP request and returns a response?
Well, I definitely think the latter. There's no technology that you need to do microservices. Of course, you need technology, but there's no specific technology you need. So it can be containerized and you can have orchestration. You could also do it with something serverless. So you could do it with lambdas and functions, and that way go higher abstraction than containers. Or you could go the other way. You could host APIs on IIS or Apache or whatever. To me, at least, that's not the important bit of doing microservices. Making good technology choices obviously has an impact. And I think just like we want to keep the services small, because that means that we have some simplicity and we have an easy code base to work with where we can actually deliver on that flexibility to the business. I think favoring simplicity in technology choices as well makes a lot of sense. And I think that makes for better microservices systems. But there's not one technology that fits that bill. Sometimes that might be deploying some web APIs to IIS, and other times it might be deploying some containers into Kubernetes, and sometimes it might be doing AWS Lambdas. So I think it sort of depends on what technologies you're familiar with in your organization, how your microservices look. The complexity of domain will probably also read a little bit into how your microservices look, and that could sort of drive you either one way or the other. What are your performance characteristics? How are your scalability characteristics? That could also drive you sort of into looking at, is serverless something for you or isn't it? But it's not microservices per se that tells you whether to do one or the other, I would say.
Okay, so I guess like all design patterns, the microservice architecture is mostly technology agnostic then?
Yes, I agree with that. Well put.
would you recommend that listeners start out with a greenfield or a pre-existing project when trying to learn microservices? Are they better to start with, this is a completely brand new project that I'm going to design from the ground up to use microservices, or should I take a pre-existing monolithic application and try to break that down?
I wouldn't recommend one over the other. I think you can have success in both cases. I think the thing to keep in mind there is why you want to do microservices, because it does take a lot of work. So there's the risk of getting the scope of the microservices wrong and then have to moving things around between them. And that's cumbersome. And there's all the automation that I talked about that you have to build. And you have to build it sort of at scale if you're planning to support having several hundred microservices. So there's some definite cost to it. So I think really what it comes down to is the sufficient value in having the flexibility and the agility that you can get from these microservices. And if there is, then I think it's absolutely fine for greenfield, and it's also fine for carving out of existing monolith and going that way. Just remember if the motivation is really there. If we're talking greenfield, then sort of for obvious reasons, you won't have 100 microservices from day one. You'll probably have like 2 or something. But then pretty quick, you'll have 3 or 5. At that point, I think you can think about it as microservices, but you're still growing them and you're still getting more and more and more, still expanding properly. But you can still sort of follow that pattern of thinking.
Fantastic. Like I say, that seems to be pretty similar to all of the advice I've received at some of these talks where they've said, we've designing from the ground up, start with almost like a monolith, get your design right, your domain knowledge right, and break off pieces and create small, maybe not small, but so rather than creating microservices, create medium services and then maybe splinter off from there.
Yeah, I actually like that term, doing the medium services, because that ties into what I said around. I do favor having them slightly too big until you have enough knowledge to get it just right. Medium service. That's a good term. I'll steal that.
That's fine, so long as you say that it was created on the podcast.
I will.
You can take complete credit for it. I don't mind. Where can people maybe connect with you and find out updates on some of maybe any of the open source projects that you're working on if you work on them, or find out about new books that are coming out if you write any more, that kind of thing?
Well, to connect with me, I guess the easiest way is through my Twitter. So that's CHR and then _ Horsdal, and Horsdal is my middle name. But then there's also my website, which is horsdal-consult.dk. And as I said, I do want to get that blog going, but there's also an about page where people can find ways to contact me, and I try to keep that page on there up to date with the talks I'm giving as well.
Fantastic. All that really remains to say is thank you ever so much for being on the podcast, Christian, and thank you for taking some time out to talk to me about microservices.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was a complete pleasure. I was happy to do it.
You're very welcome. Like I said, thank you ever so much for being on the show, Christian, and I'll make sure to put links to all of the things that we discussed into the show notes, and thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
That was my interview with Christian Horsdal. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff we covered and a full transcript of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review in your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.